Let's talk today about the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union under Stalin's rule and control. We're in Chapter 28, Section 4. Our objectives for this section describe the effects of Stalin's 5-year plans and how they transformed manufacturing and industry in the Soviet Union. Explain how Stalin tried to control even how the people thought in the Soviet Union. So what were his tactics and his strategies to do that? What changes did communism in the Soviet Union make to society in that country? And finally, outline the foreign policy under Stalin and how that changed. What was the focus of how they dealt with international relationships? Our focus question: how did Stalin transform the Soviet Union into a totalitarian state? We first talked about the Communist Revolution and the rise and control of Vladimir Lenin. When Lenin died in 1924, there was something of a struggle for who was going to control the country going forward. Stalin came out ahead of that, and from the very beginning began his plan to exercise control over the country and its people. Pretty incredibly, through a series of what he called 5-year plans, Stalin utilized forced labor and forced collectivization, and we'll talk about what that means, and truly transformed the Russian economy and the Russian manufacturing into that of a communist totalitarian state. Under the rule of Stalin, the Soviet Union became a totalitarian state controlled by a very powerful and complex bureaucracy, or government, if you want to call it that. Beginning in 1928, he began the first of several 5-year plans. And 5-year plans were intended to build up the heavy industry in the country. Remember, as we mentioned earlier, Russia always seemed to lag behind the rest of the world, specifically Western Europe, in terms of their economic and manufacturing development. So his 5-year plans were intended to bring them into the more modern times, improve transportation, and also increase the output from their agricultural resources. He brought all the activity together under government control, and we've talked about this term before. Thus, this was a command economy where the government controlled all aspects of the economy. No free market happening here, at least in these early stages. So you could consider this the opposite of a capitalist system, which you would find in the West. Between the years of 1928 and 1939, the Soviet Union experienced tremendous growth in its industry. During this time, the government pushed workers and managers to meet these aggressive goals by giving bonuses to those that were successful and by punishing those who were not. The government was able to build large factories, even in very remote places of the country. Hydroelectric power stations, so dams and places to harnessing the power of the rivers to create electricity. Huge industrial complexes where multiple industries might be in the same location. They improved the production of oil, coal, and steel, because again, the Soviet Union is a very resource-rich country. Likewise, expanded mining operations and built new roads, new railroads, to connect these at times very remote locations. Even with Stalin's push to increase the industrial output of the nation, the standard of living for most people remained very low. They didn't directly benefit much at all from all of the progress that was made. The central planning, so the organization of the 5-year plans, was often very inefficient. They didn't use their resources very well. Some places had shortages of supplies, materials, and resources, even for the people. And other areas had surpluses. consumer products, especially those that we've talked about maybe being available here in the United States in the 1920s, were very scarce or non-existent. Wages continued to be very low. The workers were not allowed to strike, and frankly, they weren't allowed to move very far from where their working was. Many times, managers that were trying to meet these very aggressive quotas for goods that had to be produced were not so concerned about quality, so many low-quality goods were produced. Stalin also took control of the agriculture industry under government and bureaucratic control. He wanted to have more grain, more food available for the workers in the cities, and eventually he wanted to have grain available to sell on the worldwide market to benefit the country. Peasants were forced to work on state-owned farms or collectives, not for the benefit of themselves, but for the benefit of growing the food for the rest of the country. Peasants were allowed to keep their houses and their immediate possession belongings, but any of the livestock and the tools were owned by the state, all for the benefit of the state. The state also set the prices and controlled the supplies. So all this work was done collectively, again, in order to supply the grain for the workers in the cities and eventually, hopefully, to be able to sell abroad. Many of the peasants rebelled from the situation. Certainly you can imagine what it would be like to be forced to give up any land that your family might have had or earned over time, and many rebelled, which caused Stalin to come down with a very heavy hand upon those people that did rebel. Those people that held land were called kulaks, and the book refers to them as wealthy farmers. There were some that were not quite as wealthy, but Stalin believed that they were the ones responsible for this rebellion, for this turmoil and this resistance. He tried to eliminate the kulaks by taking their land and sending them away from that land to labor camps, primarily in the east and in Siberia, where conditions were terribly hard and the work was, if anything, even more difficult. In 1929, Stalin declared that his intention was to liquidate the kulaks as a class of people. As a result of Stalin putting down this resistance, thousands of the kulaks were killed or died during this purge. Stalin's efforts to eliminate the resistance from the peasants was unsuccessful. They continued to protest. This time later it came to be known as the Terror Famine of 1932. So the peasants tried to do whatever they could in order to resist this. One thing that they did was to not grow the grain so that it could be shipped off to the city, but to grow just enough that they could feed themselves. So just enough to give them their own subsistence. You can imagine Stalin's response to this. The government stepped in and seized all of the grain and used that to meet the industrial standards so that they could do what the government wanted them to do, and he left nothing behind for the peasants, and thus the peasants starved. This was reported around the world, as you can see from this newspaper article. During this time, just in the area of the Ukraine, between 5 and 8 million people died, primarily from hunger, as a result of the agriculture policies of Stalin. To keep his grip firm on his totalitarian state, Stalin, just as Mussolini had done in Italy, used intimidation, violence, and torture to keep people in line. He used the Communist Party, secret police, and other violent purges in order to ensure that everyone remained obedient both to Stalin and to the state. Spies actually opened private correspondence between individuals, so nothing was private anymore. Of course, there was no free press. Papers and magazines were not able to criticize at all the Communist Party or Stalin. Of course, there was no ability to protest. Free speech didn't exist anymore. Anyone who was a critic or was seen even in private to be critical of Stalin or the government was sent to what they called a gulag, which was a system of labor camps spread all across the very large country. And there's a good map in the book that highlights how many and where these locations were, and many died in these camps. Even after all these actions that Stalin has taken to consolidate and control his power, there was something about Stalin that was still fearful that someone or some rival party was plotting against him. So what Stalin did was take this one step further. In 1934, Stalin launched something that came to be known as the Great Purge. This time of the Great Purge is accurately called a reign of terror. His target were the older generation Communist Party and army leaders, writers, and ordinary citizens. He staged a series of trials, and they're called show trials because they were made very public. They were meant to send a message to the entire population. And confessions were tortured out of people, so false confessions. People generally were not guilty of what they were being accused of, but the forced confessions and the show trials sent the message that Stalin wanted to get out there, mainly that you do not cross Stalin and you do not cross the Soviet state. During the Great Purge, which began in 1934, at least 4 million people were purged, and by purged we mean killed, during the Stalin years. Here's the map I mentioned that shows you how many and how widespread the Gulag labor camps were. With all these activities, Stalin's power, absolute power, increased, and Soviet citizens were made very aware of the consequences of being disloyal. Another tool that Stalin used very effectively was propaganda, and we've talked about propaganda in several instances to this point. Stalin used propaganda to make himself appear very positive, almost godlike. And the word bombarded is probably correct, with stories of the successes and the positive aspects of his version of communism and the evils and the evil intentions of the capitalists. Internally, the government had total control over books, music, and art, both but what was created and what was shared. If an author or an artist wanted to create a work, they were encouraged, very strongly encouraged, to create it in the style that's called socialist realism. And the goal with socialist realism is to present Soviet life in a positive light and promote hope in what they saw as the communist future. In socialist realism, Stalin was always portrayed in a very positive light, and the heroes were the workers, the peasants of the revolution. Another way that Stalin controlled the cultural life in the Soviet Union was by promoting this concept of Russification, which was the process of making the culture more Russian. Now remember, Russia at this point, being the United Soviet Socialist Republics, consists of 11 different socialist republics. Now the old Russian part of this was certainly the most dominant and the largest, but there were many other areas, the Uzbek, the Ukraine, and other areas that were the homelands of other nationalities and other languages, other traditions, and other cultures. So Stalin was making an effort to Russify or use Russification to spread the Russian culture through these other territories as well. He required the Russian language to be used in all schools and businesses all across the entire Soviet Union. In accordance with the ideas of Karl Marx, atheism became the official state policy, or the belief that there was no God. Stalin came down especially hard on the Russian Orthodox Church, which had, through earlier times, supported the Tsar and his governments. Jewish synagogues and other property was seized. The use of Hebrew was banned, and Islam was officially discouraged. In essence, the ideas of Karl Marx and Lenin became the religion of the Soviet Union. So these were now the sacred texts, not so much the Quran, the Bible, or the Torah, but the works of Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin. Anyone who refused to conform to what the government asked them to do or expected them to do faced persecution in the form of jail time or something even worse. But despite this, underground religion remained a relatively strong movement in the Soviet Union. So we can see at this point, Stalin's version of communism is very different from what a pure communist ideology would be. Remember, in a more pure communist ideology, there would be a classless society where the peasants and everyone else and the elite would be equal. No distinctions made between the two. In Stalin's society, there were a few elite groups that emerged as the new ruling class. So again, in traditional pure ideological communism, there would not be a need for a ruling class. The elite class that emerged were the leaders of the Communist Party itself. They became the elite. They had the privileges that other members of the population did not have. They had access to the best quality goods and the greatest selection of goods. They lived in the best apartments, and they shopped in the special stores. Other members of this elite class were the industrial managers, the military leaders, scientists, and a select few of artists and writers, those that specifically towed the line of the party. One of the downsides, if there was a downside to being a member of the elite ruling class in the Soviet Union, you were also looked upon with suspicion, and you were most likely to be the subject of a Stalinist purge if it came to that. The general population did enjoy some benefits under communism that they may not have had before. Their children were required to attend school, and they were able to attend school, participate in sports, cultural activities, and classes in political ideology. In addition to the schools teaching basic skills, they also taught communist values, such as atheism and the glory of collective farming, and of course they taught the love for Stalin. Other benefits received by the general population under the Soviet state. Free medical care, greatly expanded from what existed under the Tsar. Free daycare for children so that the parents could work. Inexpensive housing, certainly not any luxurious housing, but inexpensive housing. Might be in a big public block kind of apartment building. Public recreation areas. Women likewise made gains under the Soviet system. By the time the 1930s come around, women had a pretty strong access to education and access to a wide range of jobs. Now, one of the things that was nice about this, and one of the reasons that women had to work, was because the wages for the working class were so low that even in a place like the Soviet Union, it was very difficult for families to get by, or family units to get by, with just one salary. So women were almost required to work in order for them to be able to survive. On the foreign policy front, between 1917 and 1939, the foreign policy of the Soviet Union was focused on spreading the communist ideology and revolution beyond its borders throughout the rest of the world. Lenin, before he passed in 1924, had created this organization called the Comintern, a worldwide communist organization that provided aid both in terms of advice and material resources to revolutionary groups in other parts of the world. The idea behind this was that it would help secure the Soviet state if they can create allies in other parts of the world. So if they're all following the same ideological system, They are helping support countries that might be future allies. Okay, let's talk about our terms and our people. If you want to pause this as we go through and see if you can get these answers, that would be great. A command economy, a term we've talked about before. An economy in which government officials make all the basic economic decisions. No free market. The government decides what happens. Collectives. Collectives are large farms owned and operated by the peasants as a group. So the peasants are not growing food for themselves. They're growing food that can be, in the case of the Soviet Union, grown to feed the workers in the cities primarily, and eventually, hopefully, to be sold overseas to generate money for the state. The kulaks. The kulaks are wealthy farmers, or at least farmers who had some control and who might have owned a bit of property during this time of taking over agricultural control. Gulag. The Gulag is a brutal labor camp that Stalin set up all across the country, and many thousands, millions were sent to labor camps, and many of those people died. Socialist realism. It's the way that someone creating a piece of work or literature was required to show the Soviet life in a positive light and promote the hope of this idealized communist future. Russification. It was the attempt by Stalin to spread the Russian culture across all of the provinces of the Soviet Union, all 11 of those provinces, even those whose ethnicity was not Russian to begin with. Atheism, the belief that there is no God. And finally, the Comintern, an organization established by Lenin whose purpose was to encourage worldwide revolution following the communist ideology. We'll end this section back at the beginning. By the time Stalin died in 1953, he had made the Soviet Union a military superpower, a leader in heavy industry, and in worldwide influence. But his efforts had exacted a brutal toll on his people and on his country. The Soviet people and their daily lives were dominated by a totalitarian system that was based on intimidation and terror. The reality of Stalin's communism fell far short of the promises of Lenin, and far short of what an ideal communist ideology would provide. That's important to keep in mind. Life for people in the Soviet Union was very difficult, and their lives were very meager compared with people in the West. This inequity and this repression continues until communism in the Soviet Union falls in the 1990s, and we will talk more about that going forward.